In terms of how the screenwriting influences the novel writing, pretty enormously. I studied screenwriting at the Victorian College of the Arts here in Melbourne, and while I've never actually had to produce screenplay, like I've won some awards for them, and I've written a few on spec and everything, and done some background jobs on different Hollywood gigs. Everything I've learnt about story structure and the way that a story is shaped, and the way that a story should be paced, and the way that scenes should speak to each other, and conflict should drive conflict, and with obstacles coming in, then solutions to the obstacles driving the next part of the story. All of that I kind of realized applies as equally to novel writing or playwriting as it does to screenwriting. And so it's one of the reasons, a bit of advice I tend to give young aspiring writers is to try studying screenwriting, because those lessons you learn, particularly in terms of story structure, are 100% applicable to other forms of writing, and they've served me enormously well in everything I've been doing. So the genesis of the Caretaker was kind of twofold. It was initially an idea that I had when I was back in high school, a story about this naive young woman who gets ensnared by this sort of overly handsome, charming man who turns out to be this dangerous drug lord. And I tried to write it back then, but like I was in high school, I was nowhere near capable of telling that story the way I sort of instinctively knew then it needed to be told. But the other side of its genesis actually was a friend's bucks party about 5 or 6 years ago up at this tiny little Australian ski resort that is a lot smaller than some of the bigger, more well-known ones like Mount Buller or like Thredbo, and is effectively abandoned during the off season. And we went up there for what was possibly the world's strangest bucks party. And it was just the group of us up there. No one else was around. And these empty lodges and buildings just sitting there were so eerie, and the resort was so isolated that, of course, you can't help but think, if something went wrong here, what chance is there of us being rescued or being okay? And it was so creepy and strange, and that weird liminal space of you knowing that this is somewhere that at other times of the year would be this kind of bustling, fun place to be, but right now is sort of this empty ghost town, and you're there and just this group and no one else. It was a completely intoxicating idea for a setting for a book. And then so over time, I knew I wanted to write something set there, but I didn't really have the story. And then so I thought, who would the character be who would be living here by themselves, who then comes into some strife. And that was when I remembered my high school story. That was when I remembered this thing that I never wrote. And I thought, what if it's her? And I sort of fold both into this one book. And it seems to have worked out. It was really touch and go there for a while during the writing process. There were a lot of periods where I was sitting there like bemoaning to friends the fact that I thought my career was basically over, because how could I make these two incredibly disparate stories work together? But the reception in the end, and having been nominated for the Ngaios has affirmed this. Seems to indicate that somehow it did ultimately work, which is enormously gratifying. So thank you again. What I think makes a great crime or thriller story, I think it's a couple of things. I think first and foremost, it has to be some kind of roller coaster. You have to be taken on this journey, because for most of us, our lives aren't ever really going to intersect with the darker or more dangerous side of things that characterizes what we tend to read about in crime thrillers. It's one of the reasons that we're so fascinated by them. But there also has to be something relatable in there. There has to be something real and human in there that does resonate with us on a deeper level, because otherwise it will feel artificial. And if you can bridge those two things and make a story that feels real somehow while still taking you on a ride, then that to me is what really characterizes the kind of thriller that I think is always worth reading.